The order to destroy Russia is not a military command. It is a political decree handed down from the highest level of the US administration that has fundamentally changed the rules of engagement. For years, the Russian leadership operated under the profound delusion that its vital infrastructure was protected by an invisible American shield, a US policy that restricted Ukraine from using American intelligence and weapons for deep strikes. That belief was Vladimir Putin's gravest miscalculation. That shield is now gone. The evidence of this catastrophic shift comes directly from the inner circle of the current US administration. We have heard definitive statements from key figures confirming that the policy of self-imposed restraint is over. This is the new political reality. The most critical public confession came from General Kit Kellogg, who stated with absolute clarity that unrestricted zones no longer exist. This phrase is the new official doctrine. It is the green light that Ukraine had waited for since the first days of the invasion. This is more than just talk. It is a direct authorization for reciprocal warfare. For every Russian missile strike aimed at paralyzing a Ukrainian city, there is now a green-lit, symmetric response aimed at the source of Russian power. The intelligence required to execute these difficult deep strikes, data on the movement of Russian S-400 batteries, the precise location of command posts, and the weak spots in their layered air defenses was previously withheld. Now, the full power of American intelligence is being used to find and designate targets deep within Russian territory, turning a complex military threat into a viable strategic option for Ukraine. This new political reality is the direct consequence of the Kremlin's arrogance. They assumed that their public mockery and diplomatic rebuffs of the US would be without cost. Instead, their actions have guaranteed the most severe response. The military and political leadership of the US has decided that the only way to shorten this war is to impose a reciprocal cost on the aggressor. The political decision to lift the restrictions is the single most important strategic development of the year, providing Ukraine with the political and military freedom to fight a war of reciprocal action. This is the new doctrine. For every strike on Ukrainian infrastructure, there will be a symmetric strategic response. The physical proof of this new reality was instantly delivered. The successful retaliatory strike on the Belgorod Tech and Luch substation, which plunged a major Russian city into darkness and chaos, was the result of this new political and intelligence mandate. The strike was not possible until the political permission and the intelligence were granted. The successful execution of this attack proves that the US administration is not just talking about a tougher stance, it is actively facilitating it. The consequences for Russia are now unavoidable. The war has returned to Russian soil, and the Kremlin can no longer hide its most vital infrastructure behind a diplomatic shield. The choice is now clear. Cease the aggression or face a complete dismantlement of the very systems that sustain the Russian state.
The political decision to lift the restrictions was the fuse. The retaliatory strike on Belgorod was the explosion. This was not a random military event. It was the immediate, tangible consequence of the new doctrine of reciprocal action, and it delivered a shockwave that rippled through the entire Russian establishment. For the first time, Russia is being forced to confront the harsh reality of the war on its own soil, and the resulting chaos is a powerful validation of Ukraine's eye for an eye strategy. The evidence of the strike's success is overwhelming. Following a protracted 12-hour Russian missile and drone assault on Ukrainian energy facilities, Ukraine delivered a swift, direct counterpunch. Missiles struck the Belgorod thermal power plant and the Luch electrical substation, two critical nodes in the regional grid. The physical damage immediately translated into a comprehensive social and logistical collapse. The city was not merely darkened, its basic functions ceased. We saw immediate and widespread failure of power supply, which instantly crippled the water supply because electric pumps failed. Traffic lights stopped working, transportation was disrupted, and basic commerce was halted, with stores unable to process anything but cash. This is the reality of a modern city when its energy lifeline is severed, a brutal lesson that Ukraine has now delivered directly to the Russian populace. This event was a perfect, calculated demonstration of the new rules of engagement. It was a direct fulfillment of the Ukrainian leaders' promise to answer aggression symmetrically. Russia's high command and their propaganda apparatus had consistently dismissed this threat as a bluff, convinced they had established a zone of immunity around their critical infrastructure. The strike on the Belgorod tech not only destroyed physical assets, but shattered that illusion of safety. The psychological blow is immense. It proves that the cost of terror now applies to both sides, and that the long-standing assumption of safety in the Russian rear is obsolete. The resulting panic among Russian authorities was a public confession of systemic vulnerability. The local governor was forced to issue a desperate, public video warning, admitting that due to the power loss, the missile warning systems were compromised, and urging citizens to flee the streets. This is a stark, humiliating admission of a state that has lost control over the most basic functions of security and civilian defense. The local officials who were previously spinning tales of military success were suddenly consumed by the chaos of lifelines being severed and emergency protocols failing. This contrasts sharply with the state-run media's narrative of a strong, capable nation. The reality is that the Russian rear area is fragile, and the system is not built to absorb these kinds of strategic shocks. The normalization of warfare on Russian territory is the ultimate consequence of this strike. The war is no longer a distant concept. It is a daily threat that forces the Russian military command to make impossible choices. They must now divert air defense assets away from the front lines and strategic military targets to defend civilian infrastructure, creating a no-win scenario. The successful execution of this counterstrike proves that Russia can be made to suffer the same hardships it has imposed on Ukraine, fundamentally shifting the balance of power and raising the cost of aggression to an unsustainable existential level. The era of Russia's impunity is over, and the political decision to end that impunity is the biggest threat the Kremlin has faced yet.
We have established the political authorization to strike deep into Russian territory. But for that authorization to have true strategic weight, it must be backed by assets that can guarantee delivery. That brings us to the most significant military implication of the administration's shift: the potential transfer of weapons like the Tomahawk cruise missile. This is not just a new piece of hardware. It is a fundamental shift in the military balance, giving Ukraine an asymmetric capability that completely changes the defensive calculus for Russia. The reports are clear and deeply alarming for the Kremlin. The transfer of a weapon like the Tomahawk, with a potential range of over 2,500 kilometers, fundamentally erases the concept of a safe rear area for Russia. A missile of this capability puts every major Russian military, industrial, and energy center in European Russia under direct threat, from the Ukrainian border to the Ural Mountains. Its long-range, low-altitude flight profile, combined with the intelligence now provided by the US, turns it into a virtual certainty to reach its target. This is the ultimate weapon of deterrence, a devastating tool that can impose an unbearable cost on the aggressor without requiring a massive, costly Air Force operation. This potential transfer is not an isolated event. It is part of a massive, long-term commitment that is building up Ukraine's offensive capabilities into a permanent reality. The diplomatic maneuverings that led to the Belgorod strike are being rapidly cemented with industrial and financial commitments. The proposed $90 billion arms procurement deal and the agreement to establish joint drone and defense manufacturing are proof of a profound strategic pivot. The West is no longer simply giving Ukraine supplies. It is permanently investing in its military-industrial self-sufficiency. This means that within a few years, Ukraine will be able to replenish and upgrade its deep strike capabilities independently, creating a permanent, credible threat to Russia's vital infrastructure. This is the ultimate defeat for Russia's military strategy, which was predicated on outlasting and exhausting its neighbor. The strategic consequence of introducing such a weapon is devastating for Russia's defense planning. The Kremlin must now allocate its already strained air defense assets to protect civilian infrastructure across thousands of square miles of its heartland, systems that were previously focused only on the front. This is a defensive dilemma with no solution. Russia's air defense system, as proven by the Tu-141 and Strizh drone strikes, is already inadequate against slow, low-flying targets.
Adding a sophisticated cruise missile like the Tomahawk to Ukraine's arsenal forces the Russian command to pull critical S-400 and Buk units from the front line just to defend non-military targets like power plants and major rail hubs. This is a massive drain on resources and a direct subtraction from the military's ability to wage an offensive war. The ultimate aim of this strategic escalation is to force Russia into an impossible choice. With the threat of the Tomahawk looming, Ukraine can now hold any critical Russian target at risk. The Kremlin must now weigh the political and economic fallout of continuing its terror campaign against the certainty of a devastating, unanswerable retaliatory strike on a major industrial center. This is a weapon of deterrence and a clear signal that the war will end only when Russia agrees to terms that are acceptable to Ukraine. The era of Russia's unquestioned dominance over the escalation ladder is over, replaced by a new, brutal reality where the financial and military consequences of its aggression are no longer negotiable.
We've dissected the external threat, the political shockwave that originated in Washington. But the final, most damning evidence that Vladimir Putin has miscalculated comes from the utter disintegration of the Russian home front and the occupied territories. The war is not just being fought on the battlefield, it is being lost through a catastrophic failure of governance, logistics, and morality. This is the boomerang effect of the aggression, a collapse of internal control that accelerates the inevitable military defeat. The most visible sign of this failure is the return of Soviet-era scarcity. The fuel crisis, triggered by Ukrainian strikes on refineries, has forced the Russian state to admit defeat on its home turf. We are seeing the return of rationing. The official limit of 20 to 30 liters of gasoline per car in Sevastopol and other occupied territories. This is not a local anomaly. It is a system-wide collapse of the supply chain. A nation that boasts of being a global energy superpower cannot fuel its own military vehicles or provide gasoline to its citizens. This failure of logistics cripples the small-scale resupply of the army, impacts troop morale, and is a daily, visible humiliation for the state. The Russian people are forced to confront the truth of the war every time they see a closed pump or stand in a line for a ration of fuel. This logistical chaos is compounded by a terrifying breakdown of law and order within the armed forces and the occupied regions. The Kremlin has lost control of its internal security. We see this in the successful, high-profile liquidation of collaborators like the top official in Novaya Kakhovka, who was killed in a drone attack. Whether executed by Ukrainian special forces or local partisans, these acts demonstrate that the Kremlin cannot guarantee the safety of its own appointed proxies. This creates a powerful climate of fear and proves that the long arm of Ukrainian resistance reaches deep into the Russian-controlled rear. The moral and legal rot within the army itself presents the most shocking portrait of a failing state. The Russian military is being forced to rely on a broken system that prioritizes a desperate search for manpower over any semblance of human decency or military competence. We have direct evidence of torture and abuse against their own soldiers, with drone operators being tied to trees and beaten with clubs for losing expensive equipment. Simultaneously, in a monumental failure of justice, known gang members and multi-time murderers who were convicted of horrific crimes are being released from prison and sent to the front line, a desperate attempt to fill the ranks with criminals. This reliance on cannon fodder and the open acceptance of a criminal element in the army is a clear sign that the Russian high command has completely run out of options and is prioritizing a political facade over any military effectiveness. This internal disintegration is a direct threat to the strategic defense of the Russian military. The inability to maintain a functioning supply chain, the reliance on criminals, and the systemic torture of its own troops are all symptoms of a brittle, failing state. The crisis is not just an economic problem, it is a direct assault on the regime's core claim to competence and stability. This is why the panic is justified. The war is not just being fought on the battlefield, it is being lost through a comprehensive, unavoidable collapse of the Russian home front.
We have meticulously chronicled the confluence of strategic blunders, military decay, and political miscalculation that now defines the Russian war effort. Now, we deliver the final, comprehensive verdict. The war has entered an irreversible final phase, and the conclusion is clear. Russia has lost the strategic initiative. The war is now fundamentally unwinnable for the Kremlin, and the final peace will be dictated by Ukraine. This outcome is assured because every internal system designed to sustain the Russian state is being dismantled by its own contradictions and by the calculated external pressure it provoked. The panic in the Kremlin is more than justified. It is a rational response to an existential threat. The leadership is caught in the impossible contradiction of the mobilization crisis. We know from internal Z-channel analysis that the military is screaming for a massive influx of manpower, a 700,000 to 900,000 man draft to break the frontline stalemate. Yet, the regime is politically paralyzed. It is so terrified of the social backlash and loss of control that a massive draft would entail that it would rather sacrifice its army's combat effectiveness than risk domestic unrest. This final, fatal hesitation is the ultimate act of strategic surrender, proving that the Kremlin prioritizes the illusion of stability over military victory. This paralysis is occurring as the army itself is consumed by internal rot. The contract system is a moral disaster, trapping thousands of experienced soldiers in perpetual, illegal service without rotation, fostering bitterness and exhaustion that will lead to a mass exodus when the decree is lifted. This internal decay is being reinforced by shocking evidence of command failure, torture of drone operators, reliance on convicted murderers and criminals to fill the ranks, and a complete breakdown of supply chains. The Russian military is not just losing, it is dissolving, a systemic collapse that the high command is incapable of solving. This internal disintegration is now being met with an external fist. The political paralysis in the West is over. The green light given by the US to strike deep into Russian territory has erased the sanctuary the Kremlin thought it had secured. The threat of Tomahawk missiles and the acceleration of military aid are not just symbolic. They are weapons of strategic deterrence. They force Russia to choose between two catastrophic options: risk a devastating, unanswerable strike on its industrial heartland, the LPTs, or stop its campaign of terror. This external pressure eliminates any possibility of a graceful exit for Russia. The war will conclude not with a negotiated settlement that grants Moscow concessions, but with a collapse dictated by Kiev's terms. Russia's strategic and psychological blunder, believing it could wage war without consequence, has placed it on an irreversible trajectory toward defeat. The ultimate victory belongs to Ukraine, because it has successfully turned its adversary's immense size and arrogance into an existential liability.